Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to answer a question asked by a user named John, who wants to know how to test the optimum ISO of a film. How should I test the optimum film ISO? So the first thing to do is you want to test it methodically, because if you just test it in a haphazard manner, you're not necessarily going to know what did and didn't work on a reliable basis. And the other thing to understand is that films respond differently to different chemistries and different mineral compounds in the water. So if you develop film with chemistry that's been produced with distilled water or water that's come through a water filter, it will perform differently than it will if you use chemistry that's been made in tap water, especially if you have a well system or a private well system where you can have a high mineral content in your water. So what does that mean? If you want to find out the optimum ISO of a film, the first thing you want to do is take a few test rolls. And you want to take a few test rolls of a fairly general subject that has a known tonal range. If you had a nice view that had a good range from darks to lights with shadows and highlights, a lot of mid-ranges, that would be a good subject. A tree in full sun with the sun to your back would be a good subject. Things like that, where you know you're going to get highlights and shadows and a good range of middle tones. So to test the ISO of a film, if you have it in bulk, just make yourself a bunch of about 15 ISO rolls, and about 3 should do it. Or however many different types of developing chemistry you use. If you use 9 different developing chemistries, you'll want to use 9. Go out and shoot the test rolls, and you know what the rated ISO is. So before you go out, take a whiteboard or a piece of paper or something and write down on there film type, rated ISO, ISO test roll, something like that, and information about the camera, lens. Don't use any filters. That way you can repeat the tests if you need to, and then shoot that whiteboard or piece of paper at or even your computer monitor at the film's rated ISO. That serves as your data frame up front, and if you've done everything right, then it will be properly exposed when you get your images back, and it can help you recall what you were doing with that roll. A data frame is a good idea anytime you shoot film, by the way. It doesn't just have to be for testing purposes. So now you've got your data frame. Head outside, take pictures of your subject from a very low ISO up to a very high ISO. If you have a through the lens meter, just adjust your ISO on your dial. And one thing you can do is, if you know what your regimen is going to be on your data frame, indicate that regimen. So you can say, let's say your camera goes down to ISO 25. Frame 1, ISO 25. So now when you get that back, you know your next frame after the data frame was shot at ISO 25. And then you can count from there, 25, 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, or in half stops or third stops. Just count the number of frames until you get the one that looks the best to your eye in terms of exposure and development. So you have the data frame to remind you of what you've done and to orient you as to your ISO range. So this is something you can do to ascertain whether or not your chemistry is working well, to figure out how your chemistry is working with your film, especially if you've just moved to a new place or are using a different water supply, things like that. But it can also let you know if your shooting style lends itself to the film being used at a different ISO than what you've been shooting. And the other thing you can do is you can shoot multiple test rolls like this and then use different developing times. So if you shot 5 identical test rolls, let's say, and then you had D76 at 1+1, and you developed them at 1 minute different intervals for each of the test rolls, then you could see how the developing would change the results on film. And so maybe using FP4 Plus at 125 ISO with the recommended D76 1+1 time doesn't look as good to you as shooting it at ISO 80 and pulling back the developing time a minute or something like that, or shooting it at ISO 160 and adding a minute and a half to the developing time. Those are things you would be able to learn by shooting multiple test rolls and developing it at different times in the same chemistry. So that's how I do it. and it's a pretty sound way to do it, and it gives you some pretty good information from a technical perspective on how the film's going to operate. It's just a matter of how methodical you can be when doing the testing.